0.
Hello and welcome to our CACOR members and guests to today's CACOR Values Conversation Series, June 2020 session. Thank you to our host, Art Hunter, for keeping us connected through this most useful virtual tool, while we are all adapting to living with physical distancing. In the past 3 years, values conversations consisted of short interventions from the members of the Values Committee, followed by a dialogue. Today, we will follow the same format with John Verdun, Lalith Guanaratne, and Paul Maillet bringing some perspectives to various aspects of this topic of entanglement of our times, and then we will engage into a dialogue. So Lalith now is joining. I thought we were going to play his pre-recorded video, but he is live, which is great. So, is the entanglement of these times conditioning the future? What is happening to our values in this ecology of tensions? From climate change to pandemic, these are deep social and economic tensions. While some businesses and institutions may insist that the COVID-19 lockdown has been the cause of their failure, the economic and social crisis may instead be a trigger, a catalyst for a process already underway, where counterintuitive elements at the smallest scale can form connections, entanglements. Are we in the kind of situation that is going to unleash creative destruction? And how can we face our fears and mistrust of all the changes required to survive? This is my intro, and now let's hear from John Verdun's perspective. John.
Hi, thanks. This is interesting opportunity. We live in interesting times. So I'm going to have to read. I've got about 1,000 words, so it's about 8 minutes. But the title of what I want to talk about is what happens when we experience the ground as the figure. I want to start with a quote. My favorite recent quote is, "To be truly radical is to make hope possible, rather than despair convincing." So McLuhan noted that language doesn't live in us. Rather, we live in language as an environment. To paraphrase, like a warm bath we soak in. Thus, culture and language are some of the first technologies that we shaped, and then that shaped us. Like ground shapes figure, and figure shapes ground. Our complex societies have become the ground of our sense of identity, agency, and freedom. We can order anything we want from anywhere, and through a global infrastructure of communication, coordination, logistics, and transportation, we get it. We are entangled in this technological mycelium in a way that is as taken for granted as, well, the values of mom and apple pie. The hidden ground allows us the experience of a pervasive sense of independence of will. You can do anything if you really want it. Competition has been the narrative framing our independence. COVID-19 has sparked a sort of reversal of this ground. With the universal call for physical distancing, we have had to become aware of our social ground as a new figure. The invisible people that served and supported our figure of agency and autonomy are now the essential heroes, displacing, replacing, reframing them as sacrifice workers, no longer menial labor, but citizens on the front line of national security and our happy lives. What does it mean when the invisible ground of our entanglement with others, ecology, culture, technology, that enables a figure of the atomistic, isolated, individual, self-created person is reversed, right? Now, the figure of our entanglement is our interdependence. That's what it is now with each other. Our environment, our culture, our digital and other technologies, our social civility, accepting the rules and the conditions of physical distancing. The ground is now a type of uncertainty, a questioning or challenging of autonomy, independence, self-created agency, the revelation and necessity of true social justice, of care and compassion. COVID-19 has revealed what every fan of zombie movies has learned, that, that when one person is infected, we are all at risk. That not only is survival a group effort, but the reason we want to survive is for social experience, social existence. All of this is fine, but there is a question, one that has nurtured by a long past and most recently a pseudoscience of neoliberal economics with its mathematical equations that challenge every initiative for evolving and improving our social supports, our social safety net of our interdependence. And that question is, how are we going to pay for it? The question distracts us from the underlying moral framework, the framework of how we value our values, that has become the ground of this neoliberal economic reasoning. For too long, the hangover of the gold standard has shaped our reasoning about the question of where does money come from? It's got to come from somewhere. For over 50 years, the only ground of our currency has only been well understood by the high priests of the economic paradigm of finance. Even Milton Friedman said in public to Paul Ryan, the government can never run out of money. Why? Because government can issue currency into the economy by going to the right computer and keying in the requisite amount of numbers into the desired account. That's it. There's no gold. There's no pot of gold that government must hoard for the rainy day. It's anyone interested in an accurate description of where money and currency comes from, please Google modern monetary theory. It's magical thinking. It doesn't solve all our problems. It still requires rigor in accounting for what we value and how we value our values. By understanding where money comes from, we reveal the false ground of a narrative that the government's taxes are the source of its capacity to spend and invest. But taxes aren't how we pay for that. Taxes serve other policy purposes, primarily to create good enough level playing field, to distribute power and opportunity. Just as a feudal hierarchy, still alive in most work contexts, is incompatible with a society seeking to embody democracy, so monopolies, platforms, and levels of toxic inequality and injustice are incompatible with market economies. Capitalism is not the market system that Adam Smith articulated in The Wealth of Nations. Now, one of the real barriers to understanding the power of government to issue currency is another aspect of this invisible ground of neoliberal magical thinking. And that's a moral framework, one that George Lakoff, in his works, among others, have well articulated. Success in the neoliberal free market and the strict father patriarchy narrative is a judgment that success arises because of one's discipline. One's success is a measure of self-discipline, and lack of success is a sure indication of a lack in the quality of self-discipline. This moral framework, how we value our values, entails that helping those who aren't judged successful by market results is actually an immoral act by preventing the development of necessary self-discipline. This is the same moral framework of how we value our values that determines that profits are a measure of the value an individual has earned by enacting their discipline. In this way, billionaires are rich because their wealth is a measure of their discipline, an individually earned value. The same holds for compensation packages of cadres of managers, CEOs, and everything else. But COVID-19 reveals the ground of our wealth is actually earned by the value created by our essential heroes and the public capacity for building infrastructure and widely shared knowledge. The moral framework of the neoliberal economics deems social safety nets as coddling of the poor that prevents them from developing necessary individual discipline for market success of the isolated, atomistic, selfish individual. McLuhan might have considered COVID-19 has performed like an artist by enacting an anti-environment to the previous ground environment, our sense of individual self-determination. This new anti-environment enables a better focus on the more accurate figure of the social conditions and foundations for any sense of selfhood. Our entanglement in the emerging digital environment is conditioning us for an unknowable future. How can we breathe? And I say that as a meme in the current environment, the awareness of necessary to enact this conditioning as a path to flourishing choices of both liberty and care and love of others. In short, can we enact a new moral framework of how we value our values? Can we enact a response ability to create and sustain institutions of full spectrum justice, social, economic, political, and more? The artist that is COVID-19 is challenging us with the Zen koan of enacting physical distancing while reframing our social fabric in a declaration of our interdependence. There's so much more to say, but that's it.
Okay, and is it Lalaith? Are you next?
Yes, I am. So thank you, Gabriela, for the introduction, and thank you, Art, for setting this up. And taking from where John has given a good foundation for me to jump on to this conversation. And as I sit here in my daughter's psychedelic room with the chakras in the background, today has been a surreal day because I was one of our daughters just become a doctor, and she was moving on to Cleveland to start her internship. And as parents, we thought, given the situation in the South, that we should travel there, try to go there. And then we went to the Rainbow Bridge, and it was surreal to see Niagara Falls empty. We were the only people in the entire Niagara Falls, I would say, as we drove across the Rainbow Bridge, and as those very friendly and polite and apologetic U.S. border guards who have a different kind of reputation, but they said, well, you're going to have to walk back, as the mama and papa has to walk back because the daughter will be well taken care of in the South. So it's been a surreal day, and part of what I say also comes from that notion of community. So as John talked about the atomistic individual self, which has defined the neoliberal world that we live in, the consumerist world that we live in. I, in Sri Lanka, grew up in a village. I was brought up in the village. I would see my parents in the evening. I'd be roaming around from the time I was about 4 years old. And there were the matriarchs and the patriarchs and the priests and the monks. And so it was a sense of community, sense of togetherness, sense of interconnectedness that I grew up with. And my Buddhist narrative was this notion of interconnectedness, impermanence, uncertainty, everything is gray, that I have to take responsibility for myself because I create my own karma. And that then moved on to my home garden that I had as a kid, as an 8-9-year-old kid. And then the grade 6 science lesson where the carbon dioxide oxygen cycle was taught to me. It all connected. So my relationship with the tree was not an intellectual relationship, was not something I learned just to write an exam, but I knew it was real from seeing a plant grow, seeing a plant die, seeing it give me chilies and tomatoes. So that all that kind of surprised me when I moved to the West to see that there's a different narrative, which was of course given to me in my Catholic school, my Oblate Catholic school, in talking about an absolute truth, in talking about obeying a supreme being. So I had this paradox to live with, between this notion of everything is great or everything is for sure. At the same time, then I got into an inquiry from way back when, because both my parents were teachers, and they encouraged me to inquire into things. And I looked at how all this fits in through the framework of mindfulness, because mindfulness was a basic practice for us as a Buddhist, to meditate and put a mirror on ourselves to learn how the mind works, learn how my consciousness operates, learn how my body and my mind is aligned, and then linked to nature that's around us. So in that inquiry, I realized that all of us have been nurtured in some way or another, especially from 0 to 10, perhaps a lot of our worldviews have been formed from the environment around us, and then we form those and we move on. Of course, that narrative that we got. Now, I grew up in Sri Lanka from 1959 to the late 60s, and moved to Canada in early 70s. So that worldview of mine may not be appropriate for 2020 with all the technology that's changed. The world has changed, everything has changed. So the biggest issue that I have for myself, and I speak for myself, is the fact that my reality of what I think is real right now is different to the reality that's out there. I see the delta there. What I call is the truth is maybe different to what somebody else calls the truth. There's a delta there. How I see myself as what success is, and what I might deem success, is different, because I'm still aspiring to achieve things. I'm still aspiring to get things. I'm moving forward with things. I'm growing. So this delta is what causes me the tension in my head. It is what gives me the doubt. It is what gives me the fears, the anxieties, because we are constantly on this mode of getting, growing, learning, moving forward, and trying to achieve something, and trying to find whatever that is, whatever we might call success. So this conflict within our minds is for me one of the biggest issues that the Western world, Western narrative faces, because I'm a Westerner by all means, because my parents went to Anglican Catholic schools. They were educated in English. Their second language was Latin and Greek. They were not allowed to speak their native tongue in Sri Lanka by the British at the time. So I'm very much in my, even though I grew up with a Buddhist narrative, my thought process has evolved to be a Western narrative. So that narrative and my Eastern narrative has a constant conflict between each other. So this is something that I am constantly inquiring by quietening my mind. And this then is what we are grappling with in terms of the values that are out there. Because there's such a narrative that is out there in terms of this is the absolute truth, and this is the way you have to live. This is the way you should live. So we are constantly advocating to people in a framework that may be a dominant framework that is thrown out there by a dominant culture, which is where the tension is right now. And we see that being played out in the United States right now and around the world in terms of the racist, the racist in me. And I'm saying I'm not immune to that either in the narrative that I grew up with. So all of us have those those cultural, racial stereotypes that have been drummed into us in the way we look at the world. So these conflicts, how do we deal with these conflicts? How do we learn to then also live with the paradoxes that we are facing on a day-to-day basis? And in my recording, I told a really short story to show a dilemma that I was facing over the last couple of weeks as spring came in and dawned, and the beautiful days started coming up in Ottawa. And we had moved, my wife Samantha and I and the family had moved to a new neighborhood, a new house in the last fall. And we got to know our neighbors, and they're wonderful people. They hosted us and we hosted them for tea parties, and we've got to know them really quite well over the last couple of months. But as spring came and as the dandelions started appearing in our lawns, in the front and the back, and Samantha and I were admiring the beauty of these lovely dandelions. Since we are also quite new to Canada, we hadn't quite realized the issue with dandelions and beautiful gardens. So one of the neighbors came and said, "Now you got to pull those dandelions out." And I said, "Oh, okay," because they're spreading to my lawn and blah blah blah. And then asked the other neighbor, also said, "Yes, that yes can be a problem, you know. So I think you should pull those out." So then, wanting to be good neighbors, Samantha and I started pulling these dandelions out. But now Samantha is a gardener, and I do my little bit of whatever I can do to help her. So we knew that the dandelion has a role that it plays in oxygenating the soil, in softening the soil, as well as the bees and the butterflies feed off it as spring comes on. So now we were pulling the flowers out, but every morning we'd get up, there'd be even more dandelions there. So we'd think, "Oh my gosh, got to get out there." And one of the neighbors even gave me a puller, and I'd be sitting there now pulling these out, and it's almost a losing battle. But every time I was pulling these out, I was feeling ouch. I was feeling a pain on my chest that I am interfering with nature. I am this plant is part of me, but I'm now sitting there killing it. And that tension between what I was doing, the feeling of guilt that was happening every time I was sitting there and dealing with it, became a problem for me. Then I started applying a simple mindfulness tool that I use that I want to share with you. Is I take a deep breath, quiet my mind, and I ask myself 4 questions. I call it the 4 questions of clarity, and it comes from the nonviolent communications process. The first thing I do is I take a deep breath and I say, observe. What am I observing? As soon as I say, what am I observing, I would see what's around me in real time. I would see the beauty of the sky. I'd see a squirrel. I'd see the trees and the flowers out there, because all of those things I don't see because my mind is racing at probably 750 words a minute, thinking about all kinds of other things. So what I do is I stop and quiet my mind. And when I quieten my mind, I can then ask myself a simple little question. And I ask myself, what am I feeling? Because we are emotional beings, as we all know, and often we ignore our emotions and we drive ourselves through without even considering them. And this enables me to bring my emotion out. Am I feeling some anxiety? Yes, I'm feeling some anxiety. Am I feeling some fear? Yes, I'm feeling some fear. So I can now bring it to the surface rather than letting it percolate in me, and then deal with it at a different level, at a logical, rational level. So what happens is, when this emotion arises, then I apply a very simple project management question called the why tree. If you ask yourself why 3 or 4 times, you end up going to the root cause, and then we can, when you cannot answer anymore, you're there. So what I started doing was I applied the why tree to this dilemma I was having with my dandelions. And I said, well, what am I feeling right now? I am feeling anxious. I am feeling a bit guilty. I'm feeling upset that I have to pull these dandelions out of the ground. So I said, well, why am I feeling upset? Well, I'm feeling upset for one thing because, I'm interfering with nature. Well, why is this feeling of guilt there too? Why is it a problem? Well, it's a problem because our neighbors would prefer that these dandelions will not be on the ground. So then I said, okay, why is it important that I listen to the neighbors? Then I can say to myself, well, we are living in this community. We want to belong to this community. We want to be able to build our relationship based on trust and goodwill and friendship. So that way I was able to bring this whole feeling up to the surface, and then articulate my need. So what's my need? My need is really fellowship with my neighbors. Is my need to protect the environment is there, but fellowship with my neighbors transcended that, became more important. So I could put it in perspective and say, okay, well, let me late now and then move on, because I have now put things in perspective. So this way I was able to get my emotion out of the way into a logical, rational place by rationalizing, by putting things in perspective. So then I could put it to bed and move on. So it's a really simple exercise that I was able to do to deal with a tension that I was having in my head. So one of the biggest issues that we have as human beings right now, living in this modern world, because we are told to do things based on a technologically deterministic world, in an immoral that a sense where everything is commodified, when we are not. We are spiritual human beings. We want meaning and purpose in our lives. And when that tension comes is when we get hurt. So with that, I'm gonna leave that. So I expect that this may provoke some conversations too, and I'll move on and hand over to Paul from now. Thank you.
Go ahead, Paul.
Okay, thank you kindly, everybody. Welcome. I'm going to do things a little bit differently. You have to enable my screen sharing.
No,
Art?
you have that capability already.
Okay.
It's down at the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, I see that. And when I click share screen, I get host disabled participant screen sharing.
Really now?
Yep.
No.
You have to enable my screen sharing. Got it?
Go ahead, try that.
Okie dokie. Oh, there we go. Okay, from the beginning. What I'd like to talk about is get back to the concept of entanglement. I think what John and Lalise said, extremely valuable, and would like to complement it in some ways. I do agree with you, Lalise, very much that as beings, we are beings of awareness. And in terms of awareness, we have a creative impulse, and from there we make choices, and these are acts of creation. And it is these choices that's the pivot point in all of this. In other words, that we try to have awareness as such that we can make free and unconditioned choices. So to understand all our conditioning. So entanglement, I would like to define for the purposes of this little talk here as including the entanglement of probably the three dangerous things that are going to affect us and our grandchildren and the next generation. And they do appear to be pandemics, climate degradation, conflict, even as we recover from COVID-19. Now, these are all interlinked. If we have conflict, there's a good chance we get epidemics or health issues. Conflicts can cause climate degradation, and that would go for all three of them. Pandemics can cause conflict, and we don't know what role all this has in the tensions that are going on in the United States. So I'm going to frame my comments with regards to a new consciousness that we need. And I think we're seeing the edges of a new world, a new consciousness, certainly as a result of this pandemic. I think we're living in times where leaders don't have, direct personal experiential history to react so instinctively to these disasters and that are going on. So we have a certain amount of denial and paralysis and hesitancy, and in the pandemic world, this is causing us lives in a lot of sense as they try and find their way. Certainly the next time this happens, if we have succeeding waves, you can certainly understand that response will be entirely different. It will be quicker. So responding to the entanglement, I would like to say that, you know, the suffering of a pandemic, it builds over months, as we see. Climate degradation is coming over decades, and a nuclear war or large conflict, it's in minutes. So they are all interconnected, and we need to think holistically about this, and we need global and cooperative solutions in order to deal with them all. I would like to comment on the economics, which is one of the unintended consequences. Oops, what did I just do here? And the cost and what is coming. I do appreciate, John, your modern theory, modern economic theory. But what I'd like to talk about is the reality given the current theory and practices that we're doing here. This came from The Economist, and it's saying that the public borrowing in a rich world is you know, at levels not seen since 1945. The IMF says the gross debt will be 6 trillion, going to 66 trillion, and then from 105% of GDP to 122. So the longer all the lockdowns and the unemployment last, the greater the load will be, and there's no guarantee we'll succeed in paying it off anytime soon, if paying it off is something that's going to necessary. So this is going to cause all the disruptions, and it's going to have a massive cascade effect. And it's something that we are going to have to adapt to. Because as we have each of these disasters, either climate or pandemic or conflict, we immediately adapt coping behaviors in order to survive. And these coping behaviors become adaptive behaviors. Some of them do and some of them don't afterwards. So in these times of near economic collapse, massive debts, suffering, mental health issues, the coping behaviors, what's changed? And we can certainly see all of the issues of social norms, telework going on, online meetings, guaranteed income is emerging, probably more money spent on healthcare. There was even a UN call for the cessation of conflict. Now, this has all sorts of unintended consequences. Some are very good and some are not. We can have cleaner air, less pollution, less traffic, less noise, healthcare, for example, but we have things that are collapsing. And there may be very lingering effects with regards to restaurants, tourism, air travel, the fossil industry. And in my background in defense, there's going to be huge pressures on defense budgets, and it's going to be dubious as to whether increasing militarization, you know, in the face of these debt pressures is even going to be sustainable. So the adaptive behavior is what's going to endure. And I certainly see a new mix of telework and online. I think what we're doing now may complement what we may do once we get back to the lunches, but I think it'll always be somewhere. It's no longer just a novelty, this telework and online stuff. It's becoming something that's probably being taken very seriously. Hopefully, basic income guarantee, priorities of healthcare, less spending, as I said before, maybe new green technologies, and hopefully a new appreciation of our contemplative and spiritual lives. So in the conflict domain, which is something that I have experience in, there was a lot of talk about whether a new Cold War is emerging here. And I have gone to various panels and whatever, and says perhaps it's not a Cold War in a pre-1980s sense. What we may be looking at is some sort of hybrid economic dependence of the world with some sort of animosity and military posturing going on, and perhaps entering more of an animosity war, which may have an associated arms race. And the solutions maybe to this are going to be, you know, global and economic dependence, even though some of the trajectories are saying that economics may be trending towards isolation. But I think we have to develop a more relational and leadership-centric approach to this, especially at the highest levels. The military context, do we have the pressure to sustain militarization? We're going to need reservists now. COVID, climate unrest, insurgency, beg the need to restructure defense thinking. $1 trillion Cold War weapons systems may be nothing but a Maginot Line once it faces pandemics and climate change and depression. So military overstretch in times of economic overstretch is really a recipe for the collapse of empires, no matter how you look at it. And there's some very good lectures that I heard at Ottawa University that dealt with that. So we do need a new military consciousness in the area of defense, just to bring this up. The unaffordability, maybe there'll be a collapse of expensive systems, pressure for peace and disaster operations. Maybe we need to really restructure our military to have assets that can do peace operations, disaster response, humanitarian aid, and peace and stability and aid to the civil power like never before. And it is an opportunity for the military-industrial complex to rethink and retool and reconsider what they're making. So just a quick comment on systems in nature. Systems can be characterized by a power. You create a system and it has some sort of rigidity to it. Clinging, domination, and fixation. Nature is characterized by participation, responsiveness. It works more organically and is more adaptive. So in the entanglement domain, is there space for some sort of middle path that's going to lead to peace, healthcare, maybe the preservation of nature? Or as I think Darwin once said, are we doomed to continue to be a planet that's a mindless slaughterhouse of disease, conflict, and upcoming climate disasters? So really something to think about. In the peace services field, which is where I operate, we see the negative piece. Negative piece is going to be dealing with the three things I talked about. But we have to also think about the positive piece. What are going to be the outcomes and what do we want here? And certainly they just map one-to-one. The well-being of humanity and all living things against pandemics, conservation and protection of natural environment, and global coexistence. So do we have worse to come? I think the failure to come to terms with this changing geopolitical climate health realities, if we don't come to terms with it really fast, can lead to catastrophe. Because I think if we think pandemics are bad, massive climate change, some massive hurricane, tectonic plate shift in Los Angeles, for example, will be orders of magnitude worse. And certainly nuclear war will be much, much, much worse. So I think we have an opportunity here, maybe even a breathing space, to start thinking about this in terms of consciousness. The future, we certainly need visionary thinkers, and it's a future is really a range of possibilities. That's how we exist at any given moment. And hopefully it's not warped by any unskillful bias or conditioning of the past, going all the way back to the fact that we are creatures of awareness with a creative impulse. So hopefully we can see very clearly and see the conditioning for what it is, see our biases for what they are, and maybe make free and unconditioned choices. So just a couple of questions that you may want to consider. So what adaptive behaviors do you think are the most important that we continue after this crisis? And what consciousness changes do you envision, and how do you see that playing out? So that's my presentation, John.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess the thing that was passing through my mind during all three of your presentations is the one of as you use the term, Paul, visionary leadership. And I guess it all depends on your political leanings. Some people regard Donald Trump as a visionary leader, and he has a base of 80 million people who endorse that form of leadership, and there's a bunch who don't. But this gets back to this concept of values and how everything is so entangled. How do leaders emerge? There's leaders everywhere. At the family level, there's a leader in the family, and normally that's the grandparents looking after the flock, but there's religious groups, and there's all types of teams and other arrangements where there's leadership being shown and setting a value. I mean, you use the term entanglement, and my head just spins, because I interestingly had approached this very topic, not knowing exactly what you're going to talk about, just last week, and I had come up with about 12 different things which are entangled. You've certainly picked up on some of them. The one that I think is really quite important, and you mentioned it, is the fact that we're going either into a very severe recession or a full-blown depression because of the financial overreach that we've had. Anyway, I'd like to get your comments, Paul, as to the term leadership in setting these values. Where do they come from? How does someone stand out and become a Donald Trump?
Well, in my view, I think leadership. If you look at the sentence or the adage, it says it takes a village to raise a child. So you can ask yourself, what kind of village do we have that raises such people? I mean, how competitive are they? How if it's a society of very highly predatory capitalism, for example, what kind of person's raised to the top? What kind of people do we really value at the top? I mean, who do we pay the most to? Sports people, things like that. And we see these billionaires as having a certain social stature, which really is out of phase with their utility in society. If we pay actors and actresses more than we pay policemen and doctors and healthcare workers and things like that, that says something about the village that's raising these children. And then the global village, look at the good leaders and the toxic leaders that have been raised here. The Putin of the world, for example, the Prime Minister of China, in contrast to the leader of Germany, for example, Chancellor Merkel, leaders that are emerging in Australia and New Zealand in response to this. So there is this sort of washing back and forth about people as they emerge. And certainly in the United States, I mean, the United States has a real history of going passive aggressive. You get Carter, then you get Reagan, then you get Obama, for example, then you get somebody. They seem to have this thing that swings back and forth, and probably all the problems. I know a previous person, when we were talking at the beginning there, says that Donald Trump is probably, at the current level of popularity that he's in, has a very, very good chance. But I would think that the whole social sense or the whole moral sense of the United States is going to go somebody a little more Obama-like in terms of their needs. So it's a tough question, and I appreciate it, Art. I wonder if you could put the pictures back on for everybody. Is that possible?
Yeah, we can do that. We don't have any bandwidth problems. In the meantime, Ted Manning has a question, and while he's talking and you're addressing that, I can ask everyone to put their own video back on, and if you don't know how to do that, I will do it for you.
Yeah, Paul, that was a really good discussion of the issue. In a pit of vipers, only the most toxic one survives, and I'm afraid that that people will elect whatever they think represents the best of where they come from, and they all come from different places. Every culture is different. I'm just going to raise one point. It's not a comment, or it's a comment rather than a question. The Club of Rome has just started on its own website discussion on essentially the topic, the competition between well-being. There are several members weighing different to this. We actually define value and what future we want and so on, and how we in fact measure it. And this is a bit of a breakthrough for them. It's about the first time they've ever looked beyond, as I was saying earlier, before a lot of you got on, the idea that the amount of wealth is what we're after. So it is live. And the only question I sort of have for all of you is, how would you like me to convey this? Because right now they won't let national members on. They would think it'd get too unwieldy, I think. but I'd like to bring these questions to you and put it on one of our websites. Art, which one's the best one?
You mean one of our Google
One
groups?
of our blogs, yeah.
Yeah,
Discussion.
I would think CACOR discussion would do.
Okay, because there's been 4 or 5 really good comments coming from different people, from David Corden, from the head of the EEC economic group, and so on, really starting to raise these questions and how we develop different ways of getting different values in front of the people who want to take decisions. Because if they've been pre-programmed to only look at rate of rise in GDP, it's pretty hard to get their attention on anything else.
Yeah.
Okay.
If I could make a quick comment.
Yes, go ahead.
I ran to become an MP at twice. And one thing these parties do is they send you through campaign university. So they have a little course to set you up here. And one of the very, very important things they say is when that person has that pen over the voting ballot, there's not a rational response. They can't figure out what happens at that point. And they're saying that these votes are almost entirely emotional. The way that they vote and they look at candidates and they look at all the various issues. And so if politics is fundamentally an emotional response to how we organize ourselves societally, we have to think about that.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question here from Gabriella.
Yeah, hi. It's for John Verdun. So just wanted him if he could go back to what he mentioned in his presentation about the moral framework. Could he expand on that a little bit? How does he see he can deal with the moral framework under the present entanglement? John, is he there? Maybe he didn't hear me.
Okay, sorry, I had my microphone off.
Okay.
So the idea of the moral framework came to me from reading George Lakoff, right? And he talks about his wonderful book, Moral Politics, talks about the American political situation in relation to 2 types of family. When Reagan started talking about the nation as family, everybody can buy into family values, right? We love family is the foundation of society, or a core, like it's like a cell, right? And society is the multicellular thing, but the family. But George pointed out 2 types of family: the strict father family and the nurturing parent family. And the strict father family is very conservative and Christian, God, father, women, children. And it's from there that you can start understanding, once you understand that moral framework and what I outlined around discipline, you can understand how conservatives can be pro-life and against gun control, right? Now, he talked about the nurturing parent family, which, like I've mentioned before, like when Carol Gilligan says an ethos of care is gendered, it's a feminine responsibility. To develop a masculinity requires a good dose of carelessness, right? And those things. And that patriarchy, right, the strict father is a moral framework. Now, morals aren't abstract, they aren't ethics, they aren't abstract principles. They're what we feel. They're how we value our values. So Lalit's story is not about bringing reason above his emotions. It's an ability to listen to his emotions. Fellowship with neighbors is not an abstract principle, that he felt fellowship with his neighbors, right? He felt the dandelion tugging at his heart. And so it allowed emotions to be part of his reasoning. Now, all of us have been disciplined into thinking about debt as a moral failing, right? So when I read David Graeber's wonderful book, Debt the First 5,000 Years, that book started with a question that arose. He was at a dinner with a bunch of progressives, and they were all complaining, oh, this mounting debt, what are we going to do with it? And he said, well, history is full of jubilees of debt forgiveness. And so this, woman he's talked to, very progressive, says, well, yeah, I guess so. But then she seemed sort of concerned and said, but shouldn't they pay their debts? and he thought, well, why aren't we saying, isn't there a moral obligation for someone who lends money to someone to make sure that there are conditions where that person can pay it back? If there isn't a moral relationship from lender to borrower, then it's just predatory, it's parasitical, right? So there is a moral obligation to the lender to make sure there are conditions to help the borrower pay it back. So then he also says the original Indo-European word for sin, guilt, and debt are the same word. So I've said this before, as a Catholic, I'm very aware of original sin and I never got it. But I can get original debt. None of us has created our own life. None of us built the roads that we use, developed the language that we use, created the wealth of knowledge that is the foundation of everything we can do. We are social beings through and through, and we are all endowed with original debt that we can never repay. So this is really important. Now, if my success is not just based on my self-discipline, right, but based on conditions that have supported me, conditions that have educated me, conditions that have nurtured me, right? My success has roots in my social condition. And that's a different moral framework, right? It has the obligation of nurturing us. So, again, we go back to national debt. Who is it that a nation owes when it issues currency? What the process is now, it issues a bond to a central bank. In the central bank's accounting, it goes, oh, we have an asset. So for the central bank, this is a savings, right? When the government issues money into the economy, if it issues $10 into the economy and taxes only $4 back, first, when it issues $10, it says, oh, we've got a deficit, right? We issued $10. When it taxes $4 back, it says, oh, there's still $6 we've issued. But for the economy, that $6 is an asset. It's a surplus, right? So these words that we have that have moral implication on our sense of, am I a good person? These are loaded words. This is used purposefully to make us feel sin and guilt about debt. When really, you can't play Monopoly until the bank issues currency. And it's got to keep issuing currency every time you pass go. You can't even engage in that game without the bank issuing currency. So this notion of debt, when you examine it, debt to who? Now, yes, nations can borrow from other nations, and then that's a different issue. But when a nation with a sovereign currency issues money, currency into the government, it's not going in debt. It doesn't have to pay it back. In fact, what really happens is, especially when we were just primarily paper, when it taxes that paper back, it burns it. That's the real situation. That's not magical thinking. That's not making it up. Examine the real situation, right? What actually happens around currency. So we've got this moral framework that debt is bad, that we can do anything, that we can actually be debt free. So what is it for a nation, instead of being the strict father family, to be the nurtured parent family? To create conditions of social safety, universal health care, free education, universal basic income that can unleash us from needless worry to be productive people. Because we've got to scale learning. Things are moving so fast. We have to create security so that people can take risk and innovate and try things out. If we're afraid of risk, if we're saddled with this arbitrary debt. Now, a city doesn't issue currency, a province doesn't issue currency, and a business doesn't issue currency, and a family doesn't issue currency. So yes, and those entities have to make sure they watch what comes in and what goes out. But we're all dependent on the federal government, which is a reflection of us. So this moral framework has to reimagine original debt. It has to reimagine that success is not self-created, but success is a social condition. I think, there's more to say, but I hope that's close to something useful.
Yeah, I guess as you're talking and talking about a moral framework, I'm pondering and saying, what about Lilith? He was having some concerns about his interaction with the soil and the planet. Clearly, there's debt that we have to the natural resources and the life forms on this planet because of our social structures.
Yes. So this is part of original debt, right? I owe my parents my life. I owe my culture, my language and nurture. I owe the planet life, right? So this is part of original debt. We all are in debt and we can't repay it. So this moral framework is not just about a nurturant family of just taking care of our own. It's how do we create conditions of flourishing. Okay. It seems to me the framework for the isolated atomistic individual, for the free market, greed is good. That's was a necessary narrative when we were breaking out of a feudal society, locked into a caste system, locked into a role and a status, and we needed to free ourselves and to create a concept of individuality. Now we need to recover our social fabric, the debt we owe to our culture, our society, our planet.
Okay, I don't have any other comments from the chat area. Is there anyone has a question? Just unmute yourself and let's give that a try. Okay, go ahead.
I was typing, so I won't bother. What John was talking about harks back to what Ted was saying about trying to find indicators that better reflect the sorts of things that we think are important. Value. So instead of just having an indicator that only looks at GDP, have an indicator that looks at the health of the planet in addition to. So those are all things that need to be brought into play. That's all.
Well, I wanted to make a comment. It takes a broad suite of indicators.
Yes.
That's what we were doing with the UN for years. That's in fact what we're trying to inject into the dialogue at Club of Rome and at CACOR. But the other side of this is that cultures have different prime indicators. If you happen to be in the Mid East, it's a measure of your religiosity. That is the single metric. And if you are in some other cultures, they have other ones regarding obedience to past structures or to past customs. Breaking out of the devotion to a single indicator is really not easy for any group.
Okay, we have Rob Hoffman, and if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, Rob.
Okay, I think I am. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, go.
I would like to thank all three speakers for very, very stimulating talks. The question of leadership has been raised in, I guess, by all three in different contexts. And a couple of things I'd like to say on that subject. The first is that both the Club of Rome and the World Academy of Art and Science are in partnership with UNESCO on a project that is on the topic of leadership. Clearly, it's recognized that leadership at national and global scales has been failing. And so in some sense, this is an effort to open up a conversation on what constitutes leadership. And there is a meeting coming up, I believe, in September in Geneva, should that be able to take place on that subject. My take is that good leadership is people in process that is open to uncertainty, who are able to admit that we don't know the answers, and that what's important is to open a process of dialogue and exploration that is open to answers. And as we live in an evolutionary and complex world, we need to keep on being open to the search for answers and being able to adapt as we learn more and more. It seems to me if there's anything that we can learn about leadership, the response of leadership to the COVID crisis, is that almost everybody pretended that they knew what they were doing, and issues were ordered, asking people to have faith that somebody had certainty. As far as I'm concerned, it is not until I believe it was announced in the Globe and Mail yesterday or the day before, a study being undertaken by, I think it's St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, which is to do a 10,000 wide sample testing of a sample population called serological testing, which will determine within the populations or various populations in Ontario, how many people have actually been exposed to and have contacted the virus. And you do that by detecting antibodies. But it seems to me that in the absence of such information, nobody had any certainty at all with respect to what this virus and the epidemiology of it was. And the response has provoked this enormous pandemic of fear. Unbelievable, the people that you meet who won't, show their nose outside of their house, even though they are at virtually no risk whatsoever, taking a walk on the street. So it seems to me this notion of leadership has to be open to the idea of uncertainty. And when you're open to the idea that you don't know, then at least you can take some honest steps to try and find out. And this has been notably absent in the response to COVID. I could say a lot about the subject of debt, and I kind of agree with John that the ideas of modern monetary theory are extremely important. And I guess I would suggest to Paul that unless we embrace the notions of modern monetary theory, we're going to have an awfully hard time recovering from the economic pandemic that we're entering.
Okay, let's move on. We got Vic, you're up next. Sushaman and Taha wants to go. Go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on the nature of success, because I think the nature of success that's evolved since the Second World War and perhaps before that is basically at the essence of our problems right now. You know, we've got in the U.S. alone, we got 1% population controlling 80% of the wealth. And then I look back at my childhood and I look at raised in a poverty-stricken neighborhood. I was one of my parents both died when I was very young. My mother was, I was 8 years old. My father committed suicide when he was 10. And I was raised with my aunt, whose husband was killed in the Second World War, already had 5 kids. That made 7, and there was a war veteran pension. But what I recall about that early years was how neighborly people were in this poverty-stricken area, how helpful they were. But what emerged from that time was to be successful, you had to acquire wealth. That was one of the big criteria that determined your well-being in the future was wealth. And yet, you know, I still have a problem is that's the essence of the problem now. We've concentrated wealth in so such a small percent of the population that it's creating all of these other difficulties that are arising in terms of values. We might be put too much value on acquisition of wealth and not enough on generosity, kindness, and all of the other physical attributes. So I welcome anybody's observation.
Anybody want to comment on that? All right, let's move on. Taha, you have a question? There we go.
No worries, sorry. I thought I had myself muted. So I was just thinking more about something I think both, John and Paul touched upon in terms of the interplay between reason and emotion. And like, Paul, and how, for instance, like with the electoral process, people make an emotional decision more than a rational, like a purely rational decision. And John, context to, for instance, the debt and the moral framework. And personally, I mean, I agree completely, where I think it's a more balanced approach to factor in both reason and emotion, rather than, you know, believing ourselves to be creatures of pure reason. And I was thinking even like within the context of, for instance, our response to, say, climate change, or even something as basic as, it was alluded to by others, with, for instance, greed, right? We think we're being rational and, for instance, just, okay, pursuing a career, whatever the case may be, just acquiring more and more and more and more. So how do we, spread at least more awareness in terms of getting people to realize, okay, maybe these activities aren't purely rationally driven. Maybe there are emotions at play. And maybe because of that interplay, we need to tackle it differently and just come up with a better approach of, addressing the challenges we have coming up.
Maybe I could comment.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a saying that, without feelings, it's impossible to make a decision because nothing matters. So you have to have some engine behind the rational process that's going to swing you one way or the other. And without some very, very clear awareness and seeing of what this emotion is and how it's conditioning your cognitive sort of things going on in your brain, you can get yourself into trouble. So that's just the quick point, and probably that's one of the areas of exploration that we have to look at.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
There's this guy Antonio Damasio, who wrote a book, I think in the mid-90s, called Descartes' Error. And he's a cognitive scientist. And he started researching people who had had a specific type of brain damage. They'd had lesions in the brain, so they no longer knew what they were feeling. They had no emotion. And so you would think that these people would be your champion rational actors. What Damasio found out is that they couldn't make a decision. They didn't know what was important to them. They didn't know what was valuable. Now, Carl Jung talked about feeling and thinking as both rational functions. A feeling type of person will go into a room and they assess, they sort of reason emotionally about what's happening in the room. A thinker will go into a room and he'll pay attention to the content and assess the content. So for me, the soundbite is, the truth is dead, long live honesty. Enable honest accounts, but hold accounts honest. Science has taught us the importance of skepticism and multiple lines of reasoning, but complexity is challenging us to develop multiple ways of reasoning. And so our emotions are a vital way that we reason about a situation. We sort through our feelings and emotions, and ultimately with our other cognitive tools, we come to how to value what we value. Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. We've got Susha Man next. Go ahead, Susha.
Thank you very much. It's quite enlightening topic, solution. And one thing about the depth to society and others, I was thinking when we are talking about our parents or languages, if it is looked at as a common human heritage to learn from all over the globe, it may give a little bit more cordial way to look at this. Now, before I came to Canada in early 1970s, I was following Lester B. Pearson since early 1950s, United Nations, Suez Canal, and I felt Canada had developed such a attitude to connect people together. That included even the time when Pierre Trudeau was the Prime Minister. And I thought the depth or common heritage, like we acknowledge there are a lot of big players in the world who contributed a lot, whether it was USA or Western Europe or Russia during the Second World War. And I was in Kabul in 1973. I really enjoyed my stay there. Short stay, but I really enjoyed it. It was a socialist government. And our hotel we were staying was a woman manager. And we had such a great time walking in Kabul at night time, midnight. Myself and my wife, we were just newly married. And now what happened, because it was a socialist government, and the US's wanted to create a really big problem because they were friendly with their neighbor, which is Soviet Union or Russia. And they started Saudi Arabia, US, and madrasas in Pakistan. They really started this training all these Taliban to actually create a lot of problem for the Afghan government. And obviously they were in a very weak position. They kept on asking Russians to help them out. And it really created a lot of problem. And so that actually ended up in the destruction of Soviet Union, and we had very imbalanced world. And And in 1980s or 90s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a big turmoil, and we expected them to behave like a democratic country like Canada or Western Europe, who had democracy for a long time. So our expectations were they will just smoothly become democratic, and we did not necessarily think about that it's going to take a long time and democracy. And even today we expect the Russians to forget about their sacrifices and just become like us, and we are pushing them really very, very hard, and they become more extreme leadership or some of the people there. And so understanding or this connecting people together is what I think Canada was really great, but we have gone away from that role. Anyway, that's a couple of comments I had.
Okay, does anybody want to respond to that, or can we move on?
Actually,
We have,
let me say something to that, Art, so that I can segue into what I was going to say in the beginning. See, Robert talked about the issue of leadership and how do we change the current narrative to change the whole structure. We have institutionalized certainty, and in that we need to really look at the history of the United States of America, and as we see how the USA evolved as a nation that was moving away from the monarchies of Europe and running away from religion of Europe to create this free and altruistic nation. If we just think about what happened in 1893 in the Columbian Exposition, where USA rolled out the technologies, electricity, not only technologies, but they looked at culture and religion. The Assembly of World Religions was there at the same time too. They brought different religions together too, and culture. So American hegemony really started from that narrative, and in celebrating individuality, and then the motor car also started playing the role of freedom and mobility. Even though Henry Ford started with you can have any car as long as it's in black. But if you look at the evolution of the car industry in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, I was amazed when I came to Canada. You could go to a car dealership and see the options list. You can individualize a car to such an extent. So this whole thing of individualization and the consumerist agenda feeding to that frenzy, and really taking advantage of our emotions in terms of how do we deal with our identity and attaching an identity to an appendage of a consumerist agenda. And Ed Bernays, if you do a bit of research into Ed Bernays, who's Sigmund Freud's nephew, who understood a thing or two about psychology, he is the father of PR. He and Hearst and Henry Luce, they had offices on Madison Avenue in New York in the early 1900s. In his book Propaganda, he clearly writes and shows in terms of our ego and superego, in stoking that ego by giving people a narrative that if you have this, whatever that you consume, if you wear this, if you smoke a cigarette, in fact, he was the father of promoting cigarettes to women. If you smoke a cigarette, it's good for you. It's going to show you in a great light. Your ego is enhanced. Your identity is enhanced. So this is the narrative that we are stuck in right now, which is institutionalized in the financial markets, and it has evolved based on self-obsession and greed. So unless we go back and undo that narrative, we're not going to change anything. And that's where I really talk about this notion of how about us putting a mirror on ourselves. And if you have the extreme material man on one side, if you have a spiritual person on the other side, you have monks and philosophers who have given up the material life, but who are I encounter some of these monks as the happiest, freest individuals that I have ever encountered. And if you want to see in the Ottawa area, I mean, not to promote any religion, but there are a couple of temples in the Perth area where there are Canadian-born monks who have given up on the worldly life, who are living a life of an ascetic in Perth, Ontario, men and women. It's an amazing revelation to go and hang out with them and understand where their mind's at in this whole life of a mendicant. And then you have that other extreme of the man who is the material man. So we see the possibilities for us. So how do we find middle ground in this? How do we undo the institutions that have created and props up what's called the Washington Consensus, the new liberal economics, which just talk about the GDP and deflation as a way of propping up and giving the people who have more and more money to control, and people who don't have become controlled because they don't have any other choice but be controlled. So this is something that we need to really take a serious look at.
Okay, and our next question is from Jean. Go ahead.
Yeah, yes, I wanted to make some comments concerning how we might be able to do things and how things were different in the past and how we got to the stage where we are now. My grandparents, both sets of grandparents, were homesteaders in Saskatchewan both before the dirty 30s, and they went through the Depression, where the only way in which people could survive and just basically survive was to have the community small towns where they lived working together so that everybody could survive through these horrible times. And eventually it got to the point where this whole idea of the society helping each other was the foundation, where people like Tommy Douglas came into the picture. And it's not a big surprise that it was the province of Saskatchewan that actually brought in socialized medicine for the country, in spite of the anger and the frustration of the doctors in Saskatchewan. They didn't want that. They wanted to continue to have the power. So it breaks down the power structure so that everybody has to work together. And that whole idea of a community working together to put forward things was the way in which they were able to grow and continue.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's tribalism, and we know that grows to meet whatever the demands on that small group are. You know, people do band together.
Yes, but in Canada, that was also the foundation for where the social safety nets started to come into play, and that it was more egalitarian rather than top down, and it was for the betterment of the whole group. So the veterans benefits that came in after the Second World War, the family allowances, all of those things were programs that were put in at the national level that were to help the whole society progress. So.
Okay. We've been at it now an hour and a half, and I'm coming to the point where we're saying we should be stopping this recording. Is there anyone who wants to have any last comment? We can continue on after the recording is terminated, but here's your last chance to get a question in or comment. Okay, I'm stopping the recording now.